better you have Putin because what comes after him will be worse. Well, I can't see what could be worse than Putin. Why do we assume there's going to be a nationalist that comes after Putin? In Russian history, whenever Russia's lost a major war, whether it's the Crimean War, the Japanese-Russian War of 1905 or 1917, usually it's reformers, liberals, more liberal types come to power, not nationalists who are discredited. If there's chaos inside Russia, then there's going to be even more chaos amongst Russian forces inside Ukraine, which would then be the time for Ukraine to take advantage of and try to liberate some of its territories. Anybody listening to these kinds of things has to firstly accept that what politicians like President Zelensky or President Trump say publicly is not necessarily everything they believe or the full truth, as it were, because they're politicians. They often can't say everything, and they maybe, in the case of Zelensky, have to put a gloss on things. Um, Zelensky does not want to piss off Trump, so he's not going to say, "Well, I had another terrible meeting with him." He's not going to say something like that. He's going to, you know, keep 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 pretending if need be, or keep saying that everything's going fine. I think what certainly happened is that at the beginning of Trump's coming back to the presidency, he was like 100% in the Russian camp. And at times it felt like he was still living in the Cold War era, where the Russia was this mighty Soviet Union that America had to have an equal relationship with, which wasn't reality, but that's what how we perceived it. And therefore, Ukraine was irrelevant. And this is the kind of atmosphere and impression what you ha or I had during that horrible meeting in the White House, where Trump said, "You have no cards." Now you have to add to this as well that Trump doesn't read anything. The rumor is he reads half a page. That's it. So he doesn't investigate. He you know, doesn't read detailed briefs. He doesn't get to the bottom or too deeply into a subject. His entire negotiation process showed he had no understanding of the roots of this war. This is what the Russians call it, the roots of the war, what they understand as the roots of war. Uh, Trump never understood that. I mean, when he heard the word roots, he probably thought of root beer, not of roots. So that's another factor that is an issue. Um, Obviously, 6 or 8 months on, Trump has got a better understanding, maybe now, maybe not as deep as we would like, but he's certainly got a better understanding. Maybe he has listened to some briefs. Maybe has become a bit more balanced in his views. He's certainly, I think, disillusioned with Putin and the Russian leadership after the Alaska summit, which and we still don't understand why he agreed to that because it was a complete waste of time. Um, but Trump had this believed in this mythology that somehow he had a personal relationship with Putin, which Putin never did. Um, you know, if you look at Russian media or Russian TV, they are often laughing at Trump. This is somebody who changes his mind all the time, who doesn't have a fixed opinion, who doesn't really get it. The Russians keep talking about the need to resolve the roots of the war. The American side have zero understanding of what that means, which, uh, to explain it very simply, um, means Ukraine's only way of existing is to be a Russian puppet state. That's what it basically means. And you can go into it deeper. I mean, it's But the Russians refuse to accept a fully independent Ukraine, which is separate to Russia. So the only perspective for Ukraine in Russian eyes is to resemble Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus. That's what they mean. That's what they mean by the roots of the war. I don't know anybody in the Trump administration, maybe Mark Rubio, but of course he's now become a sycophant of Trump, who understands that. Now, Trump, I think, has shifted his opinions to some degree, in that he has seen how Ukraine has been successful in taking the fight to the enemy. That seems to have impressed him. So that could be a factor in him changing his mind, changing his approach, shall we say. Um, and um, this is especially the case with Ukraine's very successful campaign to destroy Russia's energy sector, which is obviously having results. And Trump has probably been briefed about this because if Russia is unable to export oil and particularly oil and gas, then that will maybe have an impact on oil prices and will allow maybe the United States to export more. So maybe he's looking at it because of that reason. But certainly, I think today he no longer thinks this little ridiculous country called Ukraine has no cards. I think he's definitely changed his mind about that. Zelensky is obviously a bit more diplomatic towards him, so that's maybe changed the atmosphere. There's also a lot of smooching from the Europeans towards Trump, particularly the Finnish president. The British have been playing up to him. So all of that has a role in him adopting. I mean, the worst case scenario would have been two things, which haven't happened. The worst case scenarios would have been that the United States stopped providing intelligence to Ukrainian armed forces. Um, and there has been a very deep level of cooperation between Ukrainian intelligence and American intelligence since about 2016, if not earlier. There was a very long and detailed exposes of this in the New York Times. And this is a relationship where the Americans, in many ways, get more out of it than the Ukrainians. But nevertheless, it's good for both sides. So that's the first one. That's continuing. Um, Secondly, what's continuing is some kind of arms supplies. Yes, what's changed is that the Trump administration is now selling them. It's not providing them free of charge, as it were. So the Europeans, EU and NATO and G7 are buying weapons for Ukraine using various funds, government funds, or interest accrued from frozen Russian assets. So Trump is open to that. And that's important, particularly on areas like air defense and maybe some other areas that. But what I think Trump is still has doesn't seem to have much knowledge about is that there's a whole other area which is taking place, which which he doesn't seem to be aware of, and that is this massively growing, and I'm not exaggerating here, massively growing cooperation between Western defense companies, including the United States, Western governments, and Ukraine's defense sector. This is ballooning. It's really getting big. It kind of took off last year, and now it's got become very big. The Pentagon, for the first time in its history, is actually buying Ukrainian military equipment. It never buys non-NATO equipment. This is the first time ever and that's the reason for this, and the reason why the Europeans are approaching the Ukrainians is because they have zero capabilities that can deal with modern warfare, the kind of warfare taking place in Ukraine. When um, when uh, Russia fired 19 drones into Poland, Poland only shot down four of them. When Russia sends hundreds of drones and missiles into Ukraine every night, Ukraine's destruction rate is 90%. Um, NATO uses $400,000 Sidewinder missiles off jets, 400,000 each missile. Ukraine's anti-drone interceptors cost $1,000 each. Obviously, you can't keep using those missiles. It's simply stupid to use a $400,000 missile to destroy a Russian Iranian drone that costs $20,000, $30,000. But using Ukraine's interceptors, you can. So we have a situation which maybe also has impacted on Trump as well, that countries like Poland, and remember the Polish president is nationalistic, so he has good relations with Trump. Um, Maybe that is also impacting on Trump. And the to me the comical situation is that you have the Polish president who is against Ukraine joining NATO, um, and yet the Polish government, which is a different political party, is begging the Ukrainians to come to Poland and train them on anti-drone warfare. The whole thing is ridiculous. The whole thing is irrational. Ukraine should be a member of NATO because a NATO with Ukrainian side can defeat Russia. I do not believe the NATO we have now without Ukraine and without potential American involvement can defeat Russia. The Russians are simply ahead of the game. In terms of NATO, NATO is behind the times on dealing with this modern 21st century warfare. Ukraine is available, but they don't want to let Ukraine into the club, but they are desperate for Ukrainian technological know-how and Ukrainian training. A rather ridiculous situation. So that whole area is also taking place, and you have very many Western defense companies using the best place in the world as a testing ground, which is Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, for various prototypes. They're working together, collaborating together with Ukraine on various military products. Um, Ukraine today is this is why the change in policy of the United States is less important. Today, 60% of military equipment used in Ukraine is produced inside the country, with the help, of course, of Western financing, Western cooperation. Often that's done with joint joint factories, with German, Finnish, or whatever, British. Um, and some Ukrainian companies are beginning to export surplus equipment, which is great because that means, money comes back to Ukraine. And even more interesting, some Ukrainian defense companies are building joint factories in European countries, Denmark and Britain in particular. And it's not surprising, therefore, that Russia's not very happy with the situation. Hence, all the drone activity, which of course is Russian, around Denmark in the last week or so, and the explosion, major big explosion this week at a military warehouse in Swindon in England, which again had to be Russia as well. And it was in the city of Swindon where there was projected to build a new British Ukrainian factory by next year to produce various types of military equipment. So all of that is taking place. Probably some of that information is seeped back to Trump as well. So he certainly has changed. Now, the question of can Ukraine liberate all of its territory? I mean that's I think, an important statement in the sense that it leads to increases morale amongst Ukrainians trapped in the occupied territories who feel that they've been abandoned. But at the same time, it's difficult to see how this can happen without some kind of Russian collapse. Um, and and this is where we have this kind of war of attrition between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, so um, possibly, we'll see something taking place later this year or next year, but Russia seems to be in a kind of uh, growing desperation, massive fuel crisis, economy, etc. So we simply don't know where this is going to end. But I mean, the ideal scenario would be 1917 when the Tsarist army disintegrated. Is that going to happen in Ukraine? We don't know. Reading comments from Russian military um, soldiers and officers, there's a lot of discontent with the way they're treated, with the high levels of casualty, and long levels of service and just poor conditions. So, but you could counter that by saying Russians are servile, Russians are sheep. I mean, why haven't they rebelled until now? There's already 1.1 million casualties. But it's difficult to see how that can continue. In the Ukrainian case, from that point of view, Ukraine's done a very good job in taking the war to the enemy. Um, because the
Is
casualty rate is something like for every one Ukrainian casualty, there's about 8, 10 Russians. So, I mean, that's a pretty good proportional rate. I suspect a lot of this information is finally seeped into Trump, um, but um, but how this will impact on the ground is difficult to know. Sure, but the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was unexpected. Nobody um, predicted that it was going to happen so quickly. I predicted in an article, I think in 1990, and I said maybe by 1993, 94. But it happened a lot quicker, and events just spiraled. And I suspect the same thing would happen here. Um, I think there are two potential theories of what would happen in Russia. Firstly, that the country is an empire, so it would disintegrate into national republics. I'm very skeptical about that, except for Chechnya and the Northern Caucasus. There's no question that Kadyrov, as soon as he sees something like this happening, he will declare independence, just to save his own skin. Well, but Chechnya is unique in that sense. I just can't see how, Buryatia and all these other kind of republics like Tatarstan are going to declare independence. I
Mhm.
think more likely is that Russia returns to the 1990s, which is a very weak central government and a kind of a semi-failed state, with warring groups, a lack of central control over the regions, of this massive country. Um, the other, I think, debate is what happens in Moscow because uh, the Russians have always tried to use the game of claiming, better you have Putin because what comes after him will be worse. Well, I can't see what could be worse than Putin, but why do we assume there's going to be a nationalist that comes after Putin? In Russian history, whenever Russia's lost a major war, whether it's the Crimean War, the Japanese-Russian War of 1905 or 1917, usually it's reformers, liberals, more liberal types come to power, not nationalists who are discredited. So again, we don't know about that. Obviously, Putin is very afraid because there's no honor amongst thieves. There is a reason for a long, thin table. And and the most likely scenario would be kind of infighting inside the Kremlin. Um, and we don't know how long Putin has got to live, by the way. I mean, he's not exactly a young person. So all of that could lead to chaos, civil war. I mean, once that kind of eruption and processes start spiraling inside Russia, then the Russian army in Ukraine is um, would be unable to function because Russia is a highly hierarchical society and state structure and military structure. The Russian army cannot exist, cannot function without strong hierarchical orders. So if those orders are not happening from the top, then the thing just begins to disintegrate. It begins to become ineffectual. A great example of this is in about 1989, when Putin then was based in Eastern Germany in the GDR. And you had all these protest groups and crowds approaching the building where he was based, the Soviet intelligence officers or military center where he was based. I think he was in Potsdam. And he rang for help to to a Soviet military base. And they said, sorry, we have to wait for orders from Moscow. So he realized he was on his own. And I think that would work, would happen as well, the same kind of thing, that if there's chaos inside Russia, then there's going to be even more chaos amongst Russian forces inside Ukraine, which would then be the time for Ukraine to take advantage of and try to liberate some of its territories. Now, that would be a lot easier to do in, say, Zaporizhia and Kherson than in, for example, Crimea, especially, or even in the Donbass. But that would lead to an ineffectual Russian occupying force, which is what you want. Um, and inside Russia, what another example to think about is Prigozhin's mutiny in the summer of 2023, when very small force of about 3,000 only nearly reached Moscow. They weren't blocked. Typically, um, and this could be again another example of what would happen, because typically the Russian forces, which should have blocked him, they're all waiting to see which way the wind blows, who's going to win, which side's going to win. And many of those officers just happened to become ill at that time and they sign themselves into clinics and hospitals where they sit down and, sorry, lie down and wait to see the outcome of the rebellion, which side's going to win. And all of that could happen at that same time. Is Ukraine ready for something like that? I think they are. I mean, Ukraine's intelligence services now on both these SBU and GRU are some of the best in the world now. So they also have partisans on the ground in occupied Ukraine, have sympathizers. Um, there's a lot of hatred for the occupiers there. Um, and Ukraine has incredibly well-trained and well-experienced troops. So I don't think that would be, if the Russian army was incapacitated inside Ukraine, I don't think it would be very difficult for Ukraine to reclaim territory at that time. But the bigger problem, and this is where discussion hasn't taken place in a big way, is what happens then? Because reintegrating occupied territories is very, very difficult for all sorts of reasons. You have to remove all the Russian presence in the banking system, the media, judiciary. security forces, schools, all of that has to be brought back to Ukrainian. Um, you have to deal with collaborators. If they haven't fled, if you catch them, what do you do? What is collaboration? If a teacher continues to teach in a school under Russian occupation, is she a collaborator? Possibly. Um, so, if you take out a Russian passport, are you a collaborator? I mean, all of these questions are very difficult to deal with, but and Ukraine's not the only country that's had to deal with that question. So those questions are kind of down the road, but it would seem that maybe this war is going to be resolved in 2025, 2026, because this level of attrition, destruction, and casualties, civilian and military, can't go on forever. Simply, it just can't. Um, and and Russia isn't this great power that Putin claims or thinks it is. It's simply, it's got an economy smaller than is it Spain, I think, or Italy, um, or certainly smaller than New York. So it can't continue forever. So a crunch is coming. Um, I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians are prepared for that crunch. Whether they're prepared for the aftermath is a separate question. And there's always going to be sticking points like Crimea, which is, let's face it, it was always pro-Russian even prior to 2014.
Although it voted for Ukrainian independence and away from
Sure, sure,
Russian
sure,
sovereignty.
sure it did, but that was a long time ago. And in Zaporizhia and Kherson, they've only had Russian indoctrination since 2022. In Crimea and Donbass, they've had it since 2014. And both of those regions, Donbass and Crimea, were controlled by by pro-Russian communists and pro-Russian party regions. So they were always different in that sense. But uh, but I mean Donbass is potentially an open question, but Crimea it would be I think a difficult nut to crack. Although you know it's difficult to see how Crimea could continue to exist under Russian occupation if Ukraine liberates Southeast Ukraine, because then Ukraine controls that whole area.